I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is
Jim
Jim
and
and Garrett
Garrett
at
at
the
the movies.
movies. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Jim and Garrett at the movies. Today we have skipped over Toy Story, which we had promised you last time we were literally together. Amazing. We had skipped over Toy Story, and we're going straight to the big film of the box office of the summer box office. It's the next film in the MCU once again, tearing up the box office just like Endgame did before it. Spider-Man Far From Home. We're pairing that, of course, with last year's entry, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, comparing the Tom Holland Spider-Man with the Miles Morales version. So, what did you think of Spider-Man Far From Home, Garrett?
Well, it had, I think, an incredibly difficult niche to fill. It had a lot of things it had to successfully do in order to sort of play its role both in the larger MCU, but also be a sort of a film in and of itself. It had to follow up on the events of Endgame, and it also had to sort of deal with both the sort of emotional impact of what happened at the end of Endgame, and it had to sort of work on building up the next phase of the MCU and sort of start setting things up and setting the tone for that, while at the same time also being just sort of a fun Spider-Man film. And when you consider the number of balls that it had to juggle, I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, I'm surprised might be the wrong word, but I was pleased. I wasn't blown away. I didn't think it was phenomenal. Certainly not the best MCU film, but I do think it was a notch above Homecoming,
I
which I thought
agree.
was a solid film. But overall, yeah, excellent, not excellent, solid, competent film.
Solid, competent film. Damning with faint praise, are you? Yeah, I am. So I think the best way to talk about Far From Home for me is to contrast it with Homecoming. And Homecoming, from it was trying to be both a comic book movie and a high school drama. And for me, the high school drama bits and high school comedy bits, actually, too, those did not work for me in Homecoming. I know Ned was sort of the darling of the internet after Homecoming, and he didn't work for it. That character didn't work for me. I didn't find him as funny and charming in Homecoming as the rest of the internet did, which fine. We all have our different tastes, and overall, the film as a whole, Homecoming didn't work for me. Far From Home somehow got the alchemy just right when it came to the the relationships between the high school characters. So the high school drama comedy worked for me in this one, and I think it's partially because they put Ned in a completely comic role, and that's right where he's suited. I think Homecoming tried to have Ned be both a comedic character as well as have some emotional resonance for Peter Parker, and I didn't think that meshed as well in Homecoming. But in Far From Home, I think relegating him to a completely comic character worked almost perfectly. And so it's the Ned thing that I think they got right, but also I want to lay the reason I'm recommending this film is almost laid completely on Zendaya's shoulders. She is absolutely charming as MJ. She has an effortless grace. She has an effortless uh she is able to communicate so much effortlessly. This is just a really strong natural performance that I think is overshadowed by some of the comic booky stuff, but it shouldn't be. She is what grounds this movie. She is what makes this movie enjoyable, and she's doing a lot of the heavy lifting as it relates to the high school drama comedy bit, and that's I think she's the almost the entire reason why it worked for me.
I agree. I don't wouldn't say it's the entire reason, but definitely her performance was fantastic. I mean, she was fine in the role of MJ in Homecoming, but I think it was a smaller part there. She was a little bit more of a background character. Here, she takes more of a center stage, both in terms of screen time and in terms of sort of emotional significance. The chemistry she has with Tom Holland, I thought was excellent. I really bought the two of them having the
Yes,
complicated sorts of feelings that they had for each other.
me
Um,
too.
uh, that worked really well. Yeah, I'm not really familiar with Zendaya's work in general, but I agree. Her performance here was solid. Like you said, just natural. It did not feel like acting at all. It felt like she just was this person. And from
Mhm.
what little I can tell from sort of glancing at her before talking, it appears that she's not that person at all. This actually is a very very different sort of character than her sort of natural persona, as it were. So all the more credit to her for being able to carry it off. So as you say, effortlessly.
Y-
Um, I also think want to some other background shout outs for some of the other characters. I have always loved John Favreau as Happy Hogan.
mhm.
I think that he usually gets sort of smaller parts, and he usually works as a smaller parts. He takes a slightly larger role here. I'm glad to see him, John Favreau, both on both sides of the camera. I like him as a director, and obviously since he directed Lion King, he's sort of competing with himself here. But he strikes me as a person who just really seems very transparently decent and solid. I could be reading into that, of course, but I really like him as Happy Hogan. It's a good performance, both sort of with that balance again of comic relief, but also sort of comic booky action, fun stuff.
And he gets some a moment of pathos too. There's a look that he gives at a certain point in the film that has some emotional resonance. And I think it's only an emotional resonance for fans of the MCU rather than fans of this film in particular. But that there's a moment that I thought worked really well and that he carried well. So I think I think we're basically agreed that the high school stuff kind of worked in this film. Is
Yeah,
that right?
yeah, I think so. And again, part of what it is again is that doesn't actually take place in a high school. It takes place on a Euro trip, which sort of removes it somewhat from the high school. And they do an excellent job, I think, just of showcasing the various different settings, all the different cities, which are sort of prominently advertised in the poster that has Spidey's face with all the stickers from the various different cities that they visit there. And having been to most but not all of those cities, again, it made me feel like made me feel like I was in those places, which it's a travel movie can sometimes struggle to do, but this film nailed that quite nicely. Also, quick word of note: it seems to have a four-act structure. I think, interestingly enough, which is uncommon. At least that's the way I paced it. And I felt the sort of the weakest part of the film was the second act. It's after they've gotten to Europe when they are fighting the elementals. It felt kind of paint by numbers. It felt kind of rote and kind of obvious. But of course, once the big twist happens and you enter into the third act, I think the game ups. We will not be spoiling anything here, so spoiler-free reviews as always. But suffice to say, once the twist happens, I felt the film got a lot better and it was much more satisfying once it moved on to that third and fourth act.
Yeah, I think I didn't pace it out structurally the way you did. I was pretty sure that it was a 3-act structure, but then again, I always expect these things to be 3-act structures, so maybe I wasn't watching for it. You might be right, and I might be mistaken on that.
I would like to talk it up, but I don't think we can do it without by keeping to
Spoiling,
our spoiler-free promise. So maybe
right.
off there we'll talk about that.
So I think a way to frame the discussion, at least that would work for me, hopefully it'll work for you too, is I think of this film as kind of two movies. We've got the high school shit that we've already talked about, and then we've got the comic book stuff, where Spider-Man is dealing with the events of Endgame and the Elementals. Um, and the villains associate the villain plot, so to speak. Um, and obviously that part of it, there are two sequences in this film. One involving, this is not going to give too much away. One involving a drone that I thought was absolutely ridiculous and kind of unbelievably dumb. And at that point, it almost it almost shot the comic book side of this film. And then when we start to do sort of backtrack the villain's plan from the beginning, that I also think has a great many holes in it. And it's weird that this comic book movie, that the comic book parts don't work for me as much. What were your thoughts, Garrett?
I think I generally like the comic book stuff. I mean, again, one of the things I think we can talk about later, and we can contrast it into the Spider-Verse, is how comic booky is comic booky, and precisely what we mean by that phrase. But I mean, just take for example the character of Mysterio, who is a character who I've always enjoyed. Back from my days when I used to read comics, which I don't do anymore. But when I did, I thought Mysterio was always a great villain, interesting sort of psychological mind play type character, and I thought that they did him right. I thought Jake Gyllenhaal's performance was good and solid. They took some interesting new directions with it, of course, but that's sort of to be expected given the translation and the updating. But I've wanted to see Mysterio for a while now. I wanted to see Mysterio a hell of a lot more than I wanted to see Vulture, for example. Who Vulture is a villain I never particularly cared for. But Mysterio really worked, and again, don't get me wrong, Vulture worked in Homecoming, but it worked because they did it right, not because the core character I thought was particularly good. In this instance, I thought they had a core character that was particularly good, and they also did him justice.
Yeah, I think that's where I disagree with you because I'm not so on board with Mysterio. Everything that goes on with Mysterio in this film. I think the plan doesn't make a whole lot of sense once we get to the end and see it all revealed. And I think that there's a sequence. I think it's the sequence that that I'm talking about, and viewers who've seen the film know what I'm talking about. I think that one was just dumb, and it's sort of neat. It was a dumb excuse to. It was really a waste of time in the movie.
Actually, not sure which sequence you're referring to, so I look forward to figuring out what it is.
It involves a drone and a bus,
Okay.
and it's in the first or second act of the movie, depending on how you parse it.
Okay. All right. Another one you're talking about now. I didn't think it
Yeah.
was all that dumb, but whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So that one really didn't work for me. But anyway, so that's yeah. I guess that's where we differ on this film. But whether or not that means that our overall scores differ, that's going to be an interesting question. Do you have anything else you want to say about this before we score it and move on?
I think I'm pretty much set.
So what do you give it out of 5?
Out of 5, I give it 3.5.
I give it 3. And it's mainly the high schools. The things that didn't work for me in Homecoming worked for me in this movie. And I credit you, Zendaya. I credit you. All right, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, 2018's Best Animated Feature winner at the Oscars. This tells the story of Miles Morales becoming Spider-Man. It's an animated film. It stars Shamik Moore, Jake Johnson, Haley Steinfeld, Mahershala Ali, Brian Tyree Henry, Lily Tomlin, John Mulaney, and of course the perfect voice for noir Spider-Man, Nicolas Cage. I included this in my top 10 films of last year, which you can see on this channel as well. My top 7 movies of last year. What did you saw Spider-Verse relatively recently? What did you think of it?
This is a film that absolutely should not have worked. When I first heard that they were doing it, and I heard the concept, I thought it was a terrible idea. It seemed like it was going to just be a disaster, and I could not have been more pleasantly surprised. I mean, everyone told me it was phenomenal, so as my expectations did revise from my initial impressions. But you just try to go into it as cold as possible. But absolutely everything about this film works. I struggle to find a flaw in this film. The animation is absolutely wonderful. It's stylized. It's varied. And the different characters from the different universes each sort of have their own, not just their own voice acting, but their own animation style. The relationships between the characters work. I mean, just as sort of a microcosm of the whole thing. One of the long-standing complaints I have had about superhero movies is one of the mistakes that they make over and over again is they when you you go into the sequels, they have to up the stakes. It's not enough to have one bad guy. You have two bad guys. You have three bad guys. You have four bad guys. And just when you get that many players on the field, it spreads things out, and the film's just ruined. See Spider-Man 3, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3 as sort of the apotheosis of this flaw. This film makes that mistake, but it's not at all a mistake. It manages to balance, several of the main Spider-Man villains in ways that are both, sort of compelling and interesting. They take many different twists on some of the classic characters. For example, Dr. Octopus is now a woman, which is, I think, a really interesting move. I never read the Miles Morales Spider-Man. I was sort of interested in seeing, knowing a little bit more about it, and I feel this was a phenomenal introduction to cinematic introduction, that is, to this character. The coming of age, the sort of the maturation stuff is wonderful. The music is phenomenal. I mean, it's like really every single thing about this film works. It's so rare that you find a film that just works on every single thing that tries to that it aims for, and this film aims for a lot. So it's very, very impressive.
Yep. I'm so happy you like it. See, we saw it together, and I didn't yet ask you what you thought about it because I knew we were going to do the podcast on it. And I am so happy that you enjoyed this movie. I love this movie. I really love this movie. Nicolas Cage, man, perfect voice casting for noir Spider-Man. Sometimes I won't let matches burn just to feel the pain. Something, anything. Yeah, it was perfect voice casting. John Mulaney as Spider-Ham is hilarious. Haley Steinfeld as Spider-Gwen. Like, all of this it works so well. It is the most visually interesting film of the year. The frenetic animation. In my Twitter review back in December, I wrote, thrill ride with the most striking animation of the year. Sometimes the film was too much too quick for me, but most of the time I was wishing my theater had a seatbelt. My theater seat had a seatbelt. And that's exactly how I feel every time I watch this. It's a thrill ride. It's a glorious film. But the best part about it for me is that Miles Morales is the center of this film. It understands that its main character is Miles Morales. It understands that this is a film about him telling his story, and that the other Spider characters are adding to his story. They know how judiciously to use all of it, which is similar to your point about the villains, but I think it's writ large across the entire film. They know exactly how to use the supporting characters to support his story, not just have these larger than life characters overtake it.
Now, I think, again, I don't mean to take anything away from the directors. I can't pronounce them. Bob Perschetti, I think it is, and Peter Ramsey. But
Yes.
I suspect that a tremendous amount of the credit has to go to the screenwriters, and Lord and Rodney
Lord and Miller.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kelly,
Rodney Rothman was also credited on the screenplay, but Lord and Miller were generally given the most credit.
right, and their previous film, the Lego Movie, inspired a similar reaction to me. This shouldn't work. This should be terrible. It should be awful. But somehow they managed to not only sort of take this high concept idea and pull it off, but managed to balance a tremendous number of elements in a way that's artful, fun, frenetic, fast paced. And exciting and interesting. Again, as I was saying when we were talking about Far From Home, you said the comic booky elements didn't really work for you. Well, Into the Spider-Verse is pure comic book. I mean, this is like the closest adaptation to a genuine comic book that I think I've ever seen. It has the feel, like, not just because it's animated, but in part because it's animated, but it really feels in terms of the pacing and the reality of it, and the tone of the whole piece. It feels like it's very much comic book. And again, that's something that I think, had you asked me in the abstract, I would say is a bit of a problem. I mean, when you're making a film, you want to adapt it to the medium. You still want to be true to the sort of the core roots of the comic, but you want to recognize that film is a different medium, and you want to do things differently accordingly. I don't think this film does that. This film does not play by that convention. It doesn't try to sort of act as though different rules apply to it because it's a cinematic feature. Instead, it stays very much completely true to the spirit and the feeling of a comic book film, which to many people, I think you in particular, particular would probably be put off of. But because it executes so damn well, it doesn't hurt it at all.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I mean, when I was referring to the comic booky sections of Far From Home, I was specifically referring to basically all of the plot that involves Spider-Man being Spider-Man, and Mysterio being Mysterio, and the Elementals being the Elementals, and all of that stuff. That was specifically what I was referring to. But yeah, I mean, let's contrast this with an experiment that didn't work, and that was Ang Lee's Hulk. That was a film in the early days of comic book movies that tried to render what it is like to read a comic book in cinematic form. Now it didn't work. It was a nice experiment. Good try, Ang Lee. Didn't work, but this is unabashedly a comic book film, and it does work. And I think a lot of that has to do with the animation style. I think it has a lot to do with the animators and the artists that are working behind the scenes to render this film the way it is.
I somewhat agree with you. I mean, Ang Lee's Hulk was trying to capture something about comic book movies, in particular, again, the interframing and stuff like that. But that was more sort of an aesthetic gloss. I don't feel that Ang Lee's Hulk, tonally, or in terms of pacing and structure, I mean, I never really read Hulk, so maybe it was true to Hulk's stuff. But overall, it didn't feel to me like a comic book movie in terms of the tone and the pacing. And large part of the reason why the film just bogged. It went on for long stretches where very little of interest happened. Um, the exact opposite is true for Into the Spider-Verse. It has, like I say, a frenetic pace. Everything is lightning fast. But I mean, you said sometimes it's a little too much, too fast. I never felt that. And again, obviously, that might be a sort of a mood or attitude thing. Maybe if I'd been in a slightly different mood, I would have felt that a little bit more. But I was carried along for the ride very thoroughly, and never in the least bit bored. And that's again, a young kid reading comic books. If you're bored, they're doing something wrong. Movies get a little more latitude in some ways in that because their pacing and structure is different. But this captured all that works, all that's awesome about comics, and none of the baggage, none of the problems that sometimes bring these sorts of projects down.
And I want to highlight a specific scene that I think is indicative of what you and I are talking about, and that's when Peter Parker and Miles are talking, and they end up having a conversation on the side of a building. And they're just walking down the vertical edge of this building, and of course the camera is showing us sort of perpendicular, showing us these characters perpendicular to the ground, and they're walking just as you and I would walk down the street. Now that's something that in a live action film it would be too hard to make that work as effortlessly as it works in the animated film. It would be a long day of shooting, and then you'd have to construct the sets and tilt the camera and blah blah blah, and it would just be easier to have them walking down the street. But I think this film goes the extra mile, and a scene like that brings us into the Spider-Man world, where walking on the side of the building, on the vertical edge of a building, is just normal. And I think that's the type of thing that this film, it's a subtle thing, but it adds so much to the world of this movie and brings the audience in on the world of this film.
Yeah, and so apparently there's talk going around about the possibility of Spider-Gwen possibly getting her own spin-off here, which I'm totally down for. I would love to see Spider-Gwen in a feature film. Again, that's another character that I have no sort of background exposure to. I mean, I know Gwen Stacy, but never Gwen Stacy as Spider-Gwen. So I really hope this creative team comes together, and not only does a sequel into the Spider-Verse, but gives Spider-Gwen her own spin-off. That would be awesome in my opinion.
I'd buy a ticket for that too. What'd you give it out of 5?
4.5 out of 5. You were absolutely right. This was one of the best films of last year.
Yep, I'm at 4 out of 5. But yeah, still one of the best films of last year. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for this show. We will hopefully go back next week, and we will see what we're going to do next week. We've got Stuber in the theaters. We've got Lion King coming out. I think both of us kind of don't want to see that movie, but we'll talk that. And our programming might be a little more varied in the coming days, because hopefully my life might get busy soon. That's a tease. All right. So until then, my name is Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this has been
Jim and
Jim and Garrett
Garrett.
at the movies.